Welcome to Session 7 of Surveying Christianity's African Roots. Fracturing of the Roman Empire and the Western Church split, late 3rd through early 4th century AD. Let's begin with a review of the previous session. In our previous session, we talked about the temperament and faith of Berber people, the new Roman Emperor Diocletian in 384 AD and his tetrarchy. Africa accounted for most of the tetrarchy's martyrs. African Christians were put to death for faith in Christ in and around Mauritania, Gaul, Numidia, and Africa Proconsularis. Young African women Christian martyrs. The alleged betrayal by the Bishop of Carthage and his deacon. In today's session, we will explore persecution and martyrdom accounts in and around Libya. Persecution and martyrdom accounts in and around Egypt. The abrupt loss of emperors shake up the Roman Empire. The Edict of Toleration, a split in Christendom, African congregations in the West versus everybody. Congregations in Northwest Africa, the Ethos and Dissent. Emperors wrestle for control over the Roman Empire. The Edict of Milan, Magnus's appeal on behalf of Northwest African congregations. Non-Romanized Northwest African Christians clash with Romanized Northwest African Christians. Frustrating, marginalizing, and targeting dissenting congregations. So for a historic context, please note that the martyrdom accounts in today's session occurred under Augustus Diocletian's jurisdiction within the Roman Tetrarchy. At the end of the 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian reconfigured the territories around Cyrene. For the very first time, Libya became a political state, not simply a general category for territories beyond Rome's African provinces, like the term outback, or the term frozen tundra, or the term rainforest. In this reconfiguration, Diocletian did the following. What is now coastal Libya was known during this time as Tripolitania and Pentapolis. The territories divided between the Africa Proconsularis to the west and Cyrene, as the arrow points to, in the east. In 296 AD, Emperor Diocletian reconfigured these territories to form the new provinces of Libya Superior and Libya Inferior. For the first time in history, the term Libya was used to describe a political state. Setting the territory up as a political state meant a more deliberate and a more focused rule in the region. Also, Emperor Diocletian thought it necessary to root out Christianity in those regions, resulting in more persecution and more martyrdom accounts in and around Libya. Here are a few of them. There's Theodora of Cyrene, the holy women of Libya, Sibylla, Lucia, and Ero. Except for a few surviving fragments Many Libyan martyr stories were likely destroyed or buried under ruins during Augustus Emperor Diocletian's persecutions there. There remain evidence of vast number of Christian monasteries in the great Libyan desert, which suggests that Christianity hadn't been exterminated by the emperor. East of Libya is Egypt, also under Diocletian's control, and persecution there was terrible. To fund his elaborate and expensive reconstruction of government, Diocletian reorganized the tax system of the empire. His attempts to bring the Egyptian tax system in line with the Roman standards stirred severe discontent in Egypt. A revolt broke out and swept the region. And by early 298 AD, Diocletian suppressed rebels in Thebes and secured control of the Egyptian countryside. Early church historian Eusebius describes thousands of men and women and children who suffered martyrdom in their native land. Here's a very brief excerpt of what Eusebius wrote. Numberless other kinds of tortures, terrible even to hear of. Some were committed to the flames. Some were drowned in the sea. Some offered their heads bravely. Others perished with hunger. Others were crucified. Still others were torn in two by tree limbs. The persecution of Egyptian Christians was so severe that out of respect for these martyrs, Egyptian Christians reset their calendar year to begin with the death of its martyrs. Consider the following. Diocletian's persecution and mass executions were so savage against Coptic Christians that they have designated the date of his military election as emperor as the beginning of the era of the Coptic martyrs. That date marks the start of the Coptic calendar, known today in the Western world as Anno Martyrum, AM, or the year of the martyrs. Take a look at this graphic to see their calculation. Now, several Egyptian persecution accounts are detailed in your survey book, but here are some notable ones. Timothy, the church reader, and his wife Mora, Rice of Alexandria, Theodora and Didymus, Catherine of Alexandria. The following is how historians have described the vast and horrific persecution of Egypt's Christians. The Coptic Orthodox Church credits Tertullian with saying, if the martyrs of the whole world will put on one arm of the balance and the martyrs of Egypt on the other, the balance would tilt in favor of the Egyptians. The early church historian Eusebius wrote in his book, Those in the Palace, how could anyone again number the multitude of martyrs in every province, and especially of those in Africa and Mauritania and Thebes and Egypt? From this last country, Egypt, many went into other cities and provinces and became illustrious through martyrdom. The year following Catherine of Alexandra's martyrdom, almost every Roman emperor either became ill, died, or abdicated the throne. And the scramble for control over the empire begins. So let's talk about the abrupt loss of emperors and how it shook up the Roman Empire. Unexpected illness, death, and abdication struck the Roman Empire. In 305 AD, in the eastern end of the Roman Tetrarch, Diocletian retires due to illness. Also in 305 AD, in the western end of the Roman Tetrarchy, Maximilian abdicates and his son, Maxentius, assumes power. In 306 AD, in the western end of the Roman Empire or Tetrarchy, Constantine restored Christians to full legal equality and returned property that had been confiscated during persecution. In 306 AD, in the West, Maxentius promised full religious toleration. In 307 AD, in the West, Maximian is recalled to the throne to help his son, Maxentius, defeat a rival. In 308 AD, in the West, Maximian and his son, Maxentius, have a quarrel, and Maximian seeks refuge under Constantine. In 310 AD, in the East, Galerius contracted a disease which he believed to be the vengeance from the God of the Christians. And on his deathbed, he issued an edict ending the persecution of Christians. He then asked them to pray that he might live. Galerius's deathbed edict is referred to as the Edict of Toleration. Let's read a portion of it. In view of our most mild clemency and the constant habit by which we are accustomed to grant indulgence to all, we thought that we ought to grant our most prompt indulgence also to these, so that they may again be Christians and may hold their conventicles, provided they do nothing contrary to good order. I think it's important to note right here the following. The former empire-wide persecutory edicts in Constantine's territory really had not been applied because Christians had become too numerous to wipe out. And besides, they could read and write and thereby were an indispensable part of government. This Edict of Toleration included the Tetrarchies, Libyan and Egyptian African regions, once ruled by Diocletian, who had fallen ill and abdicated. In spite of Galerius's prayer requests, he died that year in 311 AD anyway. Maxentius's rule in the Tetrarchy only gave the appearance of tolerating Christians, but it hadn't fully done so. Meanwhile, Christendom itself was experiencing its own fracturing. There was a split where the African congregations in the West had a great divide with all other Christian congregations. What caused this divide and the differences was simply in their practice, not in their theology. Dissent arose among a great number of rural, poor, Berber, and some Punic Christians who were a majority. They lived in the same territories that was home to most of the African early church fathers. The value they placed on their church martyrs separated them from other congregations. Their values affected their ethics, and their ethics influenced their practices. Here's how. Their distinct perspective and sentiment were rooted in the long-established Christian communities around Numidia and the Africa Proconsularis. Their intimacy with Christ was highly regarded as an expression of faith. They honored their martyrs and rendered honors to their graves. They found it disheartening that a fellow Carthage African clergy would support the Roman government's attempt to starve confessors into renouncing faith in Jesus Christ. They forbade anyone to compromise, such as disclosing the identities of Christians or handing over scriptures to Roman authorities. The majority of these Northwest African congregations wanted to go further. They refused to accept church sacraments or prayers performed by any clergy or person who had renounced Christ during persecution, or to even recognize their authority. They believed the sacrament or prayer from such clergy would be ineffective and invalid. They used all of their influence to get this perspective adopted throughout Christendom. They had some real concerns about the quality and resolve of clergy who had lapsed in their faith and returned to their congregations after persecution. Their concerns can be grouped under two categories. The first, the misuse of the specific resolution for lapse in Decius's persecution during the recent persecution. Give you a little bit of background on this. 2 persecutions ago, that would be before Emperor Decius's persecution that began in 250 AD, there was no prescribed method for the church to handle the lapse in one's faith. That is to say, before Decius's persecution, no one even thought about the need of what to do with individuals who sacrificed to the idols, who turned in Christians, who gave up the sacraments after being forced by Romans and to come back into the church. There was nothing laid out like that before Decius's persecution. But after Decius's persecution, Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, saved the day by establishing this retrospective method for mercifully accepting believers or clergy who had lapsed back into the church, but with specific conditions. So by the time of this recent tetrarchy's persecution, Cyprian's retrospective resolution had normalized throughout Christendom for 50 years. Now, in this, coming out of this recent persecution, which was the tetrarchy's persecution, the prospective reliance on Cyprian's resolution for lapses of faith was viewed as an abuse. That was one of the sources of dissension for this Northwest African congregation. The point here is this: people were now thinking that, oh, if I lapse in my faith, if I sacrifice to the idols, if I turn over the scriptures, or if I turn over other Christians, it could be okay because I can just use Cyprian's resolution and just get back in the church. So why not just go ahead and lapse since there's provisions now? That was viewed as an abuse because dissenting Congregations feared that it would diminish the value of steadfastness in one's confession of faith. They believed that believers would feel no disincentive about renouncing Christ, that believers could view lapsing in faith as a viable alternative to being tortured or put to death, given Cyprian's merciful resolution. And after doing their penance, a disingenuous believer would be restored to the church. So to add insult to injury, in light of this particular ethical concern, and after Galerius's Edict of Toleration in 311 AD, a pro-Rome bishop was assigned to represent these dissenting congregations in Northwest Africa, one with whom these congregations had an abusive experience, which brings us to the second ethical concern of this dissenting congregation. And that is, an alleged traitor had been appointed official representative of the region in which these dissenting congregations were in. Remember the riot in Carthage 7 years ago? That was maybe a couple sessions ago. The bishop, Nesurius, and his deacon, Cecilian, had prevented families and friends and neighbors from bringing the imprisoned confessors food and drink. Well, Bishop Nesurius had died, and his deacon, who was with him during that riot, his deacon Cecilian, was appointed successor and the official representative of the regional churches that included Numidia and Carthage. This infuriated these Numidian congregations. Their concerns about Nesurius and Cecilian went beyond the riot outside the prison. So the question is, what was so wrong with Deacon Cecilian becoming their bishop? After all, no leader is liked by all the people that he or she represents, and no leader is perfect. Well, let's look at a couple of points of contention that these congregations had. On the left column, you see the alleged traitors. And this is from the dissenting congregation view. I'm going to read that column first. Nesurius, the bishop of Carthage, and the primate of North Africa dies. Cecilian, his deacon, was appointed successor. Felix of Optungi had performed the ordination of Cecilian. And Cecilian was named the recognized bishop of Carthage, the primate of North Africa, to succeed Nesurius. He elected compulsory bishops and clergy. These were clergy that was mandatory for you to honor and respect. They established congregations, ordinations, and sacraments that were led and administered by compulsory bishops. But then on this right side, we have the dissenters and their point of contention with each of these alleged traitors' actions. They had accused Nesurius of ordering a mob to attack Numidians visiting their confessor, friends, and family held in the Carthage prison. One contention. They accused Cecilian of returning to the fold of the church only after the end of persecution, and then helping lead the mob against prison visitors. Also, they accused Felix of Optungi of renouncing his faith in Christ during Diocletian's persecution. And the dissenters had named Majorinus as their recognized bishop of Carthage and primate of North Africa to succeed Mansurius. They ordained their own bishops and clergy. They had their own separate congregations, ordinations, and sacraments that differ from the compulsory clergies. But note what's in yellow at the bottom. Both were Trinitarians, believing in the same scriptures, believing in the same faith tenets, and Christian doctrine. So let's take a closer look at their rationale for disputing Cecilian as successor and representative. I just want to highlight it here, even though I've already read it. He was accused of being pro-Rome and a traitor who lapsed in faith during persecution. That's one. Two, he had been improperly ordained by Felix because Felix himself had renounced his faith, allegedly. And because of all of this, Cecilian was not above reproach based on 1 Timothy 3:2. This caused a seismic divide throughout Christendom, not in the theology of the Christian faith, but in church practices and administration. Cecilian's appointment was like a thorn in the foot for dissenting congregations. Not only did they contest it on church and biblical grounds, but also based on being the majority congregation in Cecilian's region. However, their candidate, Majorinus, was not selected to replace the deceased Bishop Mansurius. Meanwhile, several Roman emperors wrestled for control over the empire. And also, the Berber Christian Lactantius, who was trapped homeless in Nicomedia, reunites with a familiar emperor. It appeared that Rome wanted Cecilian to represent the congregations in Africa's northwest, but those congregations wanted Majorinus to represent them. This may have been a power play that was somehow key to a particular Roman emperor's wrestle for control over the empire. In addition to bringing the homeless Christian African Berber scholar Lactantius back on the scene, the Emperor Constantine rediscovered the former professor, the Berber Lactantius, his elder and now a Christian, living in poverty. Declaring himself Lactantius' sponsor, because Lactantius was poor and homeless. He only made a living by writing speeches for people, just carved out a meager existence. But Emperor Constantine brings Lactantius back onto his staff as an advisor on religious policy and a tutor of his son. In 312 AD, the emperors Constantine and Licinius unite to fight against Emperor Maxentius to end persecution of Christians in the West. Lactantius' writings describe a dream that Constantine had prior to this battle that ended the wrestle for control of the empire. He details that Constantine dreamt a cross in the sky while hearing a voice utter, go and in this symbol conquer. So emperors Constantine and Licinius win the battle of the Milvian Bridge over Emperor Maecenas to end persecution of Christians in all the West. Now, believing it was a victory of the Christian God over both emperors, Galerius and Maecenas, the emperors Constantine and Licinius signed the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Let's read an excerpt from this edict. It reads as follows. All those places are, by our intervention, to be immediately restored to the Christians. And because it appears that beside the places appropriated to religious worship, the Christians did possess other places which belong not to individuals, but to their society in general, that is, to their churches. We comprehend all such within the regulation aforesaid, and we will that you cause them all to be restored to the society or churches, and that without hesitation or controversy, provided always that the persons making restitution without a price paid shall be at liberty to seek identification from our bounty, in furthering all which things for the behoof of the Christians, you are to use your utmost diligence, to the end that our orders be speedily obeyed, and our gracious purpose in securing the public tranquility promoted. So what did this Edict of Milan achieve for Christians that differed from the Edict of Toleration? Galerius's Edict of Toleration was a shift from hostility towards Christians to neutrality with Christians. The Edict of Milan was a shift from neutrality to friendliness and protection. It prepared the way for the legal recognition of Christianity. It also allowed for any other perceived deity, whether Christian, Roman, or whatever. But note, the Roman Empire had been fractured due to the loss of emperors. Tactically, the Edict of Milan healed several empire-wide ailments. It was not the emperor's spiritual awakening nor submission to the Christian God. Rome's state religion remained pagan, and it would not replace its religion with Christianity for another 67 years. Now, a studious reading of the Edict of Milan will reveal that both Constantine and Licinius believed that peace with the Christian God would ensure peace in the Roman way of life. It was not their awakening to genuinely embrace Christ. So let us look at what the Edict of Milan was and was not. The Edict of Milan was an empire unifier. The Edict of Milan was an empire stabilizer. It was not a sign of surrender to Christians. It was not the result of a genuine spiritual conversion to Christianity by either emperor. Rome continued to embrace paganism and other religions. It was not a genuine concern about justice the welfare of Christians nor God's glory. The Edict of Milan was a stabilizer. Roman emperors regularly sought their gods for success in war and for the economy. Constantine believed enough in Rome's pagan gods to not throw off the pagan concept of balancing good and evil. That is, not wanting the empire's evil to outweigh the empire's good. And therefore, to the extent this balance could be restored by bringing justice to the Christians, to that extent, the stability will be brought to heal the fractured empire. With a new, seemingly Christian-friendly Roman emperor and the end of persecution and a newly elevated African Berber to Pope of Rome and their own newly elevated bishop, the dissenting congregation's bishop, Donatus Magnus, things look hopeful for the African congregations in the Northwest. Perhaps this was a good time to appeal to the new emperor about these ethical concerns. After the Edict of Milan, Emperor Constantine commissioned the new Roman Pope Miltiades, a Berber, and 3 Gallic bishops to call a council to resolve Donatus Magnus's protests against Sicilian's appointment as a representative. So it seems like Donatus is getting the audience that these dissenting congregations wanted. However, being new, Pope Miltiades didn't want to jeopardize his relationship with the emperor, but also, as a savvy pope, he was unwilling to preside over a council with an uncertain outcome. So Miltiades changed the proceedings into a regular church synod and appointed 15 additional bishops who were Italian. The council followed Rome's strict rules of evidence and argument for civil proceedings. Well, that frustrated the dissenters, and they left the council without even presenting their case. Well, this left Miltiades with no choice but to rule in favor of Sicilian. One dissenting bishop accused Miltiades and his associates of surrendering sacred texts and offering incense to Roman gods during persecution. Okay, so it didn't go well for the Christian congregations in Africa Northwest. So let's see whether this disappointment continued to be their experience. Donatus Magnus struggled unsuccessfully against Christian clergy in Rome to obtain church recognition as Bishop of Carthage and the legitimate representative of all congregations in Africa's western part of the Roman Empire instead of Sicilian. And again, in 315 AD, he appealed to Roman Emperor Constantine a number of times, but without success. From that point forward, the dissenting congregations of Africa's Northwest were referred to as Donatists, taking the name after their representative, Donatus Magnus. Emperor Constantine instituted several benevolences that facilitated church life and expansion. But those benevolences were only for congregations on his list of recognized congregations. and on which the Donatists were excluded. Early in the 4th century, in Northwest Africa, it was Donatist congregation versus everybody. Even amongst their own country folk. So let's look at how the non-Romanized Northwest African Christians clashed with the Romanized Northwest African Christians. And obviously, this dissenting congregations were amongst the non-Romanized. Now let's look at how the non-Northwest African Christians, which would include the Donatists, clashed with the Romanized Northwest African Christians. The Romanized classes of the African proconsulators saw Emperor Constantine's benevolence to the church as a positive development. Now, they could be a good Roman as well as a good Christian. Abandoning their fears, for the first time, many openly converted and practiced their faith. However, Christians from the lower classes in Numidia and in Mauritania tended to perceive these new developments as progressive corruption of the church. They feared that the control, the insensitivity, the deceit that they had experienced from the Roman Empire was now becoming a part of the church. They feared the powerful social, political Roman machinery would control the church. To them, resisting Rome's benevolences was a necessity. They did not hesitate to remind the newly converted Romanized Christians that when you all were still worshiping pagan gods, we lower class Numidians and Mauritanians knew the truth about Christ, as well as the tactics of the Romans. The Donatists then refused to recognize clergy who had lapsed. They deemed the sacraments performed by such clergy as invalid. They considered their prayers by such clergy as unanswerable, and they rebaptized new members who had been baptized by such clergy. In one town, there was a Donatist Christian church right next door to a traditional Christian church. And speaking of Donatist congregation, let's see where these Donatist congregations concentrated in North Africa. Here's a map that shows in the center where Donatist congregations ranged. So we see Numidia, we got parts of Italy and Sicily, we got part of Sardinia and Carthage. The more persistently Donatists rejected what they perceived to be a Roman imported representation over their congregations, the more enraged the Roman Emperor Constantine became. Donatists' persistence in preserving their perspective about the spiritual integrity of clergy and believers resulted in being repressed by Roman authorities. Donatists drew upon African sentiment for support, while their rival pro-Sicilian congregations had the support and force of Rome. Sicilian was elected with the support of the Romanized Christians of Carthage. His election was opposed by the lower classes of the African proconsulators and by almost all the clergy in Numidia, who were in majority. In 317 AD, 4 years after the Edict of Milan, that ended persecution of Christians, Roman Emperor Constantine issued a death penalty to all who disturb the peace of the kingdom. The Donatists believed that by this they were being targeted, though they felt justified in their protests. So even at the end of the Edict of Milan, Christian congregations in Northwest Africa were being persecuted, not for their Christian beliefs, but for political reasons, who had the right to represent them, and perhaps for national reasons. They consist of ethnicities such as Punics and Berbers. So what did this death penalty entail? Under this death penalty, Donatists were not persecuted as Christians, but they felt targeted for not supporting the appointment of Cecilian, nor his appointees, but rather their own bishop. Constantine persecuted them for civil disobedience by several measures. He ordered the confiscation of Donatist churches and sent Donatist bishops into exile. An entire congregation was slaughtered inside a Carthaginian church. Government troops disrupted Donatist assemblies and executed members. The government offered financial incentives to Donatist church leaders for submitting to the authority of compulsory bishops. This aggression and injustice against Donatists continued through 321 AD. It was for this reason that Donatists did not recognize Emperor Constantine as the holy figure that he portrayed himself to be. And not even Rome's military was successful in deterring their resolve. It's the various attempts to snuff out Christianity in Africa's Northwest throughout its first 7 or 8 centuries that today we must be very careful not to confuse mainstream Christian literature's emphasis on Rome's Christian history with the origin and heart of the Christian faith that had extended centuries prior. There's much more church history made by ancient African scholars that predates Rome's toleration of Christians. Don't confuse Roman Emperor Constantine's benevolence towards Christian churches with the beginning of the Christian faith or the Christian church. Christian doctrine and principles for study were first hammered out and lived out in Africa more than a century before the dissenting Christian congregations in Africa's Northwest. So that's it for session 7. Next, in session 8, we are going to explore notable Christian activity in individuals in Africa's Northeast. Africans' contributions to Christianity before the Council of Nicaea. Persecution's effect upon African congregations. The First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Ethiopia adopts Christianity as its state religion. Dueling congregations, Donatist versus Nicene. Effects from independent divergence. Rome adopts Nicene Christianity as its state religion. Donatists' apprehensions are painfully confirmed. African Roman General Gildo's military coup. Catholic imperialist repression of Donatists. and more differentiating between Donatists and Nicaeans. We will be in the early 4th through early 5th century AD. That would be the balance of chapter 11 through chapter 13 in the book. Make sure you do acquire the book. For the next 3 sessions, we will explore the locations, faith, and contributions of African Christians from the 1st through the 6th century AD, Surveying Christianity's African Roots by Jimmy D. Compton, Jr. If you would like to have a spiral bound book, just go to lulu.com. But if you want a regularly bound book, you can order it through amazon.com. Like us on Facebook at The African Stop. Thank you. God bless you.